What defines a Star Wars fan? Are you supposed to love everything Star Wars puts out? To use a sports analogy, if your favorite team trades away your favorite player and the owner hires a bad coach, you're usually still a fan of that team. But your sports team often represents your city or community or a specific culture. Our sports allegiances are often tied to locality. They're grounded in a sense of who we are and where we come from. This idea of identity is full of strong emotional context. We attach labels to ourselves that identify us as a Star Wars fan or a Star Trek fan or a Marvel fan, and when we see people in charge of those brands make products or decisions we don't like, we feel like our very identity has been attacked. How can we tell other people that we're a Star Wars fan when George just made this thing we don't like?
I may have gone too far in a few places.
How can we identify as a Star Wars fan when Disney puts out something like The Acolyte? Some of us can't. If you identify as a Star Wars fan, it's probably because at some point you liked a majority of what had been made. But not every one of us has to love everything Star Wars does all the time to be a Star Wars fan. If you saw Star Wars in theaters in 1977, you were part of an experience that defined a generation and revolutionized an industry. Cinema of that era was typically dark, steeped in a cultural mood informed by the Cold War, the conflict in Vietnam, and economic malaise. Star Wars was a return to the optimism of classic cinema, where the good guys were good and they won. It was a story informed by a classic fairy tale structure. If you loved it for all its campy humor, 30s serial-style adventure, and mythic underpinnings, you were a Star Wars fan. If that's all you had, well, you had something great. But let's say 1980 comes around and you see The Empire Strikes Back and you didn't like it. Maybe you wondered why it was so dark, why your heroes were assailed at every turn and the bad guy won. What if you wished Star Wars was still Star Wars? Were you still a Star Wars fan? There were reasons that people liked or disliked what the original trilogy of films did, independent of each other. Return of the Jedi opens full of swashbuckle and classic tropes of heroism and sexuality. Then you realize they have another Death Star? Why are they retreading the same ground they already covered in the first movie? And are we supposed to believe midgets in bear costumes take down the mighty galactic empire? Stormtroopers are just falling over like bad slapstick. It's like the Munchkins beating the stuffing out of the flying monkeys. And Leia is his sister? What happened to Star Wars? When the prequels came out, of course there were kids at the time who loved them and still love them now, even if they view it through some nostalgia glasses. I was 22, married, and gainfully employed when The Phantom Menace was released. Upon initial viewing, I loved them unabashedly, and it wasn't until I started hearing other people on the internet that I allowed them to steal my joy a little.
They don't really know much about movies. They don't know the history. They don't know the technology. They don't know anything. So for them to try to analyze it, they're lost.
It's understandable that people my age looked at those films in adulthood and wondered what George Lucas had done to Star Wars.
How do Jedis procreate if they can't love? That's so dumb. How do you create more of your kind?
I mean, does he think the Jedi are a separate species or something? Why does he think that Jedi need to have sex for there to be more Jedi?
There are still Gen Xers out there saying George screwed up with the prequels, that he did a disservice to Star Wars, that on many levels the sequel films are superior. We are all generally tribal by nature. We love to slap labels on ourselves and each other. It's a primal survival instinct. We see it in politics all the time. We may identify with a certain party, and as that party makes subtle changes over time, we find that they support things we don't agree with. And we experience a cognitive dissonance that either makes us betray what we once held dear or reject what we once counted ourselves a part of. No wonder so many of us are so angry all the time. It seems like fandom is no longer about what you enjoy, independent of what someone else enjoys. We have to immediately jump to how someone has ruined Star Wars when, in fact, everything you loved about Star Wars still exists, and you can still enjoy it.
Look, it's not my fault, okay? I'm a victim. Listen, I'm a victim.
Of what? Of what?
Of
A little
molestation.
80-pound girl?
We can no longer brush off something we don't like, as comic fans have been doing for decades. Oh, I didn't really like this run of Batman. I prefer this run. Or, I actually prefer Michael Keaton's Batman to Christian Bale. Batman has been around so long, it's just different interpretations of an old legend. George Lucas created Star Wars. He had his run. He made choices that seemed right to him and told the story he wanted to tell. The expanded universe had its run, with books that ranged from terrible to masterpieces, but George Lucas didn't read them. They weren't his stories. They were basically fan fiction. And the thing about fan fiction is some of it's pretty good, and some of it sucks. If you liked the George Lucas run of Star Wars and that's all you liked, you're entitled to it. You can even think some of that sucked, but everything that came after George Lucas sold his company? Well, that's basically fan fiction.
When the mouse acquired Star Wars, all that expanded universe stuff was decanonized. Glorified fan fiction. They wanted a clean slate to tell new stories, or more accurately, they wanted an excuse to salad bar the source material, take what they wanted in the combo they preferred, and leave the rest sitting there on the tray.
They may have made a lot of money for it, and it may be slapped with the official brand, but doesn't everyone who comes aboard talk about how big a fan of Star Wars they are? If you love Star Wars, but you're not a fan of stuff that has come out recently, that doesn't mean you're no longer a Star Wars fan.
Trash compactor.
You're just a Star Wars fan who doesn't care for what has come out recently. You just don't like what the new owners of the IP have done with it. It doesn't change anything about the parts you love, but it also doesn't diminish your disappointment. And it's also okay to voice that disappointment. As a myth, Star Wars is an important part of our culture. One of the features of myth is that it becomes part of the mental furniture and sense-making apparatus for our worldview, and Star Wars fits that for broad swaths of people.
Today, millions of people, including many watching this, grew up with the Star Wars saga as part of the cultural furniture, something that was just always there. But looking at how it evolved sheds some light on how mythologies grow and spread through a culture, and it makes us consider the question of who really owns a culture's myths.
The sequel trilogy, to many degrees, is not really a faithful continuation of the story George Lucas finished with Return of the Jedi. In fact, it's not even internally consistent with itself, as Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams were never on the same page.
To keep a creative work alive, you have to create things. And it's clear, looking at this trilogy, that nothing was built here. This is the Star Wars anti-trilogy. Everyone who made it just wanted to see their version of Star Wars.
The fact is, we can all keep loving Star Wars even if we don't love everything about it, even if sometimes we criticize things about it. But what we don't have to do is attack each other over it. And that's the way it's always been. All the way back to 1977.
Hang up the rendezvous. Don't worry, Arthur. We're going.